My work is about incorporating ecosystems into cities so that cities work better. And that's both for today and for tomorrow. How we build cities today is going to have a huge impact in terms of how we can be adapted for tomorrow. And so this project that I'm going to talk to you about, the Cornell Climate Adaptive Design Studio, is really about a couple things. It's about building city communities to build adaptive capacity for cities to change. It's also about starting that process now. And then also by building, in order to do that, we can build ecosystems and build development that really is prepared for a changing climate. And so I have this thing I like to say. In fact, it says, it's basically that the downtown areas where we're from in the Hudson River Valley, and I'll talk about that in a minute, in New York State, are all seeking to grow towards the waterfront. Meanwhile, the waterfront is seeking to move towards the downtowns with some of this sea level rise that we have. And so this project really is about more than some of that flood resilience. It's actually about developing comprehensive adaptive solutions to change, both for cities today and for tomorrow. So I want to talk a little bit about our project and our location. Some of you who may be familiar with the United States know of this one place called New York City. It's a major metropolis. Here in the Hudson River, I don't think my laser pointer is going to work because of the reflective screen, but New York City is right down here. It's at the mouth of the Hudson River. And so I work in the Hudson River communities that are north of there. With massive growth and attention to New York City and its property value, there's been an extended interest in moving up through the rail lines and the rail corridors that go along the Hudson River Valley. And many of these cities are having pressure to change and grow and have development. One thing that's interesting is we often think about coastal locations as those that are going to have this sea level rise issue, but many of the rivers that are connected to them, that are in equilibrium with water, are hydraulically connected as well. And so all of these cities that are running up and down, these many municipalities that are running up and down the Hudson River corridor, are in fact taking daily tidal influences of 2 to 4 feet a day, just daily. And so sea level rise, as sea levels rise, so will these coastal community waterfronts, these riverfronts. And so there are extended projections for that risk. It's a major port river, it's a major tourism river, it's a major working river in terms of how the landscape and the waterfront come together. Also, they have risks with some of the actual freshwater watersheds that are there as well, because each one of these places, these ports, are often at the mouth of another river, which has its own watershed and which has its own flood risk associated with it due to extreme precipitation that's happening and beginning to happen today, and will be doing so more in the future. And so we've worked in 3 locations right now. The first one, Catskill. The second one, City of Hudson, and now we're working in City of Kingston. So I mentioned this project's really about building capacity. It begins there. In order to build community, in order to build ecology, in order to build some of these new changes on the waterfront, we really need to build community first. Get people on board, get them thinking about it now. Development and change happens at a slow pace in the United States, and so we really need to be thinking about actions we take on the waterfront at a very early time. And so this is about a partnership that links my academic design studio with these communities to develop alternative design strategies for a climate adaptive future. And it really is what's critical to it is a key partnership between myself and the design studio, as well as the State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Hudson River Estuary Program, as well as Cornell Cooperative Extension, and many, many partners throughout the Hudson River Valley that are focused on environmental and climate issues and growth and change issues in this watershed. It's rapidly changing, it's beautiful, and it's time to be thinking about how we can actually preserve some of those natural resource values while also preserving our ability to live in this amazing subbasin. The idea that we can develop these physically adaptive design ideas as well as inspire people to engage with it requires that we interact with them. And so we really need to find ways to get people interested in this. And many municipalities don't have the resources to do some of this climate adaptation planning or are seeking solutions that could work. And so in the academic environment where we develop these design solutions, we can come up with 5, 6, 7, 8 alternative scenarios for them to look at, compare, see points of view in terms of how this could work for some of their comprehensive planning and some of their vision for what they wanted to become or still could in an adaptive future that we're talking about. And so we really, really want to engage them and start them in on this process. As I'm talking, if you have any questions, please just feel free to interrupt me, okay? We have a little bit of time today. Yes? Great question. Great question. We engage stakeholders of all kinds. And so we are working at the state level, we're working at the county level, we're working at the city level with some of those stakeholder staff, some of those agency staff. We're also working with NGOs that have a mission for some of this work, be they Scenic Hudson or some of the other organizations that are focused on environmental and climate adaptive change. Also, we work with businesses when we can. The nice thing about this is about capacity building and bringing all the folks together that are working and living on the waterfront in a way where they can engage themselves. We actually have, currently we're working with a developer on its site or site owners, yes. Yes. So, yes, we have. In fact, the question is, how about some of the, like, what kinds of solutions might you have? And in fact, the whole back half of my presentation is about some of these technical solutions. So it's about developing technical solutions that people see the potential for as we think comprehensively. So I'll get to that. Good question. Perfect entree. I guess another thing that I think is really important to talk about in terms of my own work is that I certainly have research interests, but there really needs to be community benefits and there needs to be education benefits because we're working with graduate level design studios or upper levels undergraduate design studios. So we really need to find a way where we can get all of these types of benefits in one place. And so that's been critical. Are there any designers in the group? Any landscape architects? Architects? Good, we got one. Graphic designer. So we speak the same language in terms of process and how we go through our process of arriving at solutions, arriving at elegant solutions that work. And so in the academic environment, I was in practice for about 10 years before I went full-time in academia. And so I'm thinking not only about skills development for the students as these young professionals who will be actively changing waterfront places and places throughout New York State and the world globally, the need to have a sense of how to do that and what to be doing and to make critical decisions. Also, they'll also have an opportunity to engage stakeholders directly and understand what it means to introduce new ideas, to negotiate those ideas, to discuss their potential, and then get people interested in actually moving forward. So that's really important on the education side. On the community side, the communities we work with have at their disposal, when we're finished, alternative strategies for climate adaptation that they can look at. They may not pick just one scenario that we develop. We may develop multiple scenarios, but they may like some parts of this one, some parts of that one, some parts of the other, and put them together. We really want to inspire change. We want to catalyze this interest now while they're making decisions about how the waterfront, what it will become. Community networking and capacity building is also critical to our work. We want to work with them, we want to network with them, but what's important is when my studio is done, they're having a conversation about what they might do next. And so that's why we involve all levels of these agencies. That's why we engage them collectively as businesses and NGOs and others together to begin having this discussion with us and then also with each other so that they can continue to carry that on. They're the owners of this space. And so really getting that dialogue out in front is critical. Ongoing technical assistance is also critical because we're partnered with agencies at the state level and the city, and we actually find that it's really valuable for them to have access to these resources later. My studio will be finished in sort of the formal sense, the semester ends, but I go back, and particularly my colleagues go back, to help and assist with some of the questions they may have, to facilitate, to identify for them grants and other opportunities that they can use. And our projects are aligned around some of these grant ideas so that they have the potential to actually be applied for and therefore integrated. And so I find that to be really, really important. And so, of course, to our partners, our municipal partners. For me, I'm very interested in two things. This new idea about engaging communities, of people engaging smaller cities in ways where they can make an important difference for themselves and also for the greater ecology is really, really important. That's a new strategy, this public academic model that we're working on that works directly with communities. And then also looking at emerging techniques for climate adaptation that are much more comprehensive. Sure, flood is important, it's critical for many of these waterfront areas. And we also know that there are other climate change hazards and risks that are following from that, whether that's extreme precipitation, changes in temperature, and other things that build in susceptibilities for these cities. And so how do we react now? Because I mentioned that stakeholder engagement is a critical part of this process, we seek to involve that at all points. As we're developing our ideas and understanding what some of these climate hazards and risks are, we're also speaking with people that are experts in certain areas. What's the ecology of the area? What's your development plans for this in the future? Who are you looking to when it comes to understanding historic conditions on the site and the value that you have for the waterfront already? And many other factors. And so we understand the climate impacts, but we're thinking about strategies that react to multiple, I guess you would say, factors that can have tension with one another, but how do we put them together in a way that's comprehensive both for them in terms of their long-term planning, but also for their climate adaptation interests. This idea of engaging stakeholders, not only do we interview them in that sense, 10 or 12 interviews over the course of a 4-month process, maybe even 15 or more, but also we go to those cities, we visit those sites, we visit people's buildings that have the potential to be in the floodplain, we visit people's properties and understand what their businesses are in those areas, and then we also seek feedback. One thing we do towards the middle of our design exercises is in fact go and show some early ideas to them. We heard these things from you, we heard these were important, we have some working concepts that we've started. Let's have a dialogue, a workshop about how we might actually be more effective in inserting things that maybe you find most valuable or that maybe we didn't even know about. And so we bring that into play. Once we've done the work, we actually also bring that back again to share some of the alternative design proposals for them so that they can have them and take them with them. We're on hand at an open house to explain some of our thinking as we develop these final products, but also we're generating products for them that they can take with them. We understand that the work we do may live on well beyond the academic setting that it's in, and so they're built to actually be interpretable in the long run. And then finally, I mentioned the long-term agency support and technical assistance. Because we're partnered with our agencies, they go back and circle back and help out with opportunities to seek grant funding to implement some of these ideas. I mentioned that my design effort takes a comprehensive approach to climate change. My original training was as a biologist. I worked as an ecologist for a number of agencies across the country prior to my design practice career, where I worked in the Pacific Northwest as well as projects in China. And so because of that biological background, I'm thinking about the city as a set of systems. The energy systems, the economic systems, the ecological systems, the ecosystems themselves, the hydrologic systems, the way that people work in terms of transportation and other things in commerce. And so I look at climate adaptation from the standpoint of water system support, ecosystem support, and built environment support. Also, support for communities. That idea, when we think about resilience, we can think about social resilience, and we can think about ecological resilience, both in terms of physically and ecologically adaptable spaces. But we can also think about those two things together, social, ecological resilience. I've talked about ways where we're trying to build that capacity for that social resilience earlier on, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the design solutions that we've been developing. Again, thinking comprehensively. Can one action have multiple benefits? When we talk about climate change hazards that exist, this idea that there's going to be a greater likelihood of extreme precipitation in this area, which means there'll be more rain or more precipitation in a shorter amount of time. This sets up a couple problems. This creates localized surface flooding in watershed environments, and also it has the potential to overwhelm sewer networks and other systems, these storm sewers. Many people who are living in cities often operate on a combined sewer network. Does anyone know what that means? Okay, good, some of us do. That idea that you're putting together your storm water with your sanitary water into one pipe. And so when that happens, there's the potential for an overflow if there's too much of that storm water going into these pipes. The overflow happens, that water, the combined mixed water, which is contaminated essentially, goes into river and stream systems. And so if you can avoid combined sewer overflows, it's called, that's really, really good, both from a regulatory standpoint and certainly from an environmental and quality standpoint. And so this idea that how do we address that? How do we avoid those combined sewer overflows? One way to do that is reduce the amount of stormwater that's input, and so we look for solutions like that. Ecosystems, this is interesting because I should mention with the water, of course, there's also sea level rise and flooding and surge that's associated with some of these extreme events. Ecosystems, it's interesting and important to understand that there will be shifting plant communities as well. The whole way that when the hardiness zones are changing, these fluxes, this general warming trend, greater number of days over 90, greater number of heat waves, and the length of these heat waves is going to change the fundamental nature of where these plant communities are in the landscape. And so how do we react in ways that support them ecologically? And then finally, built environment support. Has anyone here heard of the urban heat island effect? What we experienced today? Great. And essentially the urban heat island effect is this idea that areas that have lots of hardscape, whether that's streets, whether that's buildings, whether that's cement, they absorb solar radiation and they re-radiate it back in a way that's different if you were in a fully vegetated area. And so today we have the urban heat island effect. One of my favorite slides is showing a slide of a city where they have a large park where it's 20 degrees lower today than it is in their downtown, and this is not unusual. The urban heat island effect has impacts on health and air quality and other things, particularly for the young and for the old who are more susceptible to these temperature differences if it's hotter out consistently. And then also reacting with the built environment in terms of flooding and understanding how we can work on that. In addition, we can also talk about carbon-based fuels and the reliance on those right now, and how we can design in ways that are much more collective that work with it. It's not an adaptation response per se, but it is a carbon mitigation approach that is, if we think about transit-oriented development and pedestrian-oriented development, these are the kinds of things that designers and planners are talking about now. Why don't we take some of these ideas and arrange them in a way that's much more collective? Some of these ideas are not necessarily new on an individual basis for the design and planning community, but looking at them collectively to understand how we can compound those benefits, stack the value of our design solutions that have these outcomes is what we're talking about. So you can see here, solutions for green infrastructure, for floodable landscapes, the ecosystem supports that I'll talk about in a moment, as well as built environment support. I'm going to go through each one of these so I can kind of talk about them individually. I guess what I would ask that you think about is how they have the potential for interactive effects and other benefits. The first one is this idea about floodable landscapes. The city is wanting to move towards the waterfront, and the waterfront is wanting to move towards the downtown. And so how do we program in uses into the waterfront itself, the first place where that water, that sea level rise and that surge will be happening? How do we build solutions, new ideas, new program into there where it can be useful on the days when it's not flooding and adaptable on the days when it may flood? And so this idea that through grading, and well, first of all, choosing what we put there. We want to put water-dependent uses on there, things that need to have water in order to exist. You can think about, for example, the value of some of the waterfront uses that you might have, putting those kinds of uses on the site now because they need to have the water there, and also those that are water-enhanced. A water-dependent use might be a marina, for example. A water-enhanced use might be a place that is enhanced by the presence of the water that's there. And then also we have water-independent uses. What's the most appropriate thing to be putting there? Probably something that would benefit from having water there. But through grading, placement of structure and program, and also our plan communities, we can actually improve the ability for these landscapes to both be able to be flooded, but then also to respond to flooding and therefore quickly get back into operation. And so some of these may allow the flooding, and that's something we encourage, this idea. There's several ways you can react to flooding. One is we hear about how you can retreat. You can actually move back some of those uses. You can provide adaptable solutions, and you can also fortify. And we always are seeking to do the first two. This idea about adaptability, or actually removing of incompatible uses in ways to prevent some of the risks associated with fortifying, where if they fail, then you have an even more compounded problem. Underwater system support, I talked about combined sewer overflows and the risks there, and also the overwhelming of sewer drains fundamentally. If the sewer drains, storm sewer drains are overwhelmed, you get localized flooding with these extreme rain events. And so is there a way where you can prevent that? The localized flooding is actually a really big issue, and it can happen several blocks away from where the river itself is, where that pipe is connected to. And so finding ways to work with green infrastructure. Do you guys know what green infrastructure is? It's this, okay, good. This idea that you can actually capture some of that water and infiltrate it rather than having it run off over the pervious surfaces into these catch basins or drains. And so there's all kinds of solutions that look at that. They can be very functional in terms of removing that, but they also can become an asset. Is there a way we can actually create a viable asset for that? One idea that we proposed is actually creating these almost water walks where they're capturing water after these downtown areas and providing almost like a wayfinding for people to get down to the waterfront, while then removing that stormwater runoff from getting into their local watershed. Any questions so far? When we talk about ecosystems, we talked about the shifting plant communities. This notion that plant communities will shift also means that the species that depend on them, the wildlife species that depend on them, must also shift. And so in urban environments, we often have uses that are not directly compatible with them, with their life history needs, or the susceptibilities they may face. And so this idea of providing connectivity in the landscape, so that as those plant communities shift, the species, the wildlife can also shift, is what this I guess you could say, adaptation approach is about. It also sets up working parks and other network systems that make cities more livable and improve their quality of life as they densify and change. Those are the terrestrial habitats. Many of them are very important in the Hudson River Valley. The aquatic habitats are equally important. In fact, when you are in these coastal environments, these inland coastal environments, I like to say, some of these areas function as very critical estuaries, critical fisheries, critical places for sensitive wildlife to exist. And so as we think about that, we also realize that with sea level rise, some of the projections call for, in 2050, a couple feet of sea level rise. In 2080, 4.5 feet. And so this idea that wetlands also need to adapt to that is critical. One thing to think about when you think about wetlands is the type of wetland and the presence of them is often driven by the hydrology. And so different wetlands exist in different conditions, whether it's in the intertidal zone, whether it's 6 inches, the water's 6 inches deep typically at mean sea level, whether it's at 2 feet deep or beyond. And so if you change that water level, the ecosystems also change and shift. And so the loss of the value of those wetlands for fisheries, for these places, is really, really important. It's something we might not think about because it's underwater all the time, but it really has direct impacts on the greater ecology, as well as some of the economic opportunities that surround wetlands. And this is really, really important for the Hudson River estuary, and as it is for many other estuaries throughout the world. Another thing to think about is that when we're designing these places, we work with landform, vegetation, and structure. And we also, therefore, have the ability to influence how water behaves, as well as how people find it usable. Because we work with vegetation, we're creating places for today. We design and install them, we create them for today, we want them to work for today, but they also need to work for tomorrow. And so looking at the kinds of things we plant has a huge impact on their durability, their sustainability, and ultimately their resilience to be part of this solution, both today and for tomorrow. Some of the things we install, we hope last 20, 30, 40 years or more. And so that's right within the sort of this climate adaptive condition that we're talking about. And so how do we increase the functional, the response diversity of some of these vegetative palettes is something to be thinking about. Some plants should be, perhaps they should be drought tolerant, because there's a concern that drought is coming. Some may need to be flood tolerant. There's soil moisture tolerance. That may be important to be thinking about as soil moisture content projections indicate those may change. On top of that, we also can be thinking about the functional redundancy of those things for key critical ecosystem services that some of these things provide, whether that's shade, whether that's for pollination. So if some of the things that pollinate at a critical time that are useful to the greater ecosystem have different measures of soil moisture tolerance, there's a greater likelihood that some will still be able to persist and that ecosystem service will still be able to be provided as these ecosystems change. And then also you can think about the plasticity of certain plants. Some plants have a high hardiness zone range. Well, that means that they maybe can work within a number of different scenarios that are out there. And so looking at all of those things when you think about planting for today and design for tomorrow is critical. Again, none of these things operate independently of themselves. They need to work collectively. Some of the plant choices we make will also have impacts on the urban heat island effect, the effect that we're experiencing today and that we'll also be experiencing tomorrow with these higher temperatures, the higher days over 90, degree days over 90, also the higher number of heat waves in their length. That will set up an urban heat island issue that's beyond what we experience now. And so how we look at that is also important. And so can we be providing shade for these impervious areas? Can we be providing shading of buildings to reduce their cooling needs and those kinds of things? That's how we do that. Can we reduce the amount of impervious that's actually there that's absorbing this heat? Here I talked about multimodal mobility, this idea that we can reduce vehicle trips by providing alternative transportation strategies for people is also important. We can look at that collectively. It's a fundamental design and planning perspective. And then also flood-proof structures. It's really interesting with Irene and Sandy hurricanes that have existed in the recent past in New York State. We are beginning to see cities, businesses, and other developers think about how they can flood-proof their existing buildings and also create new buildings that are flood-resistant. There's two ways of doing that. One is to do what's called dry flood-proofing, where you actually flood-proof a place by preventing the flooding from getting in to a building. And then you can also actually create buildings that are adapted to flooding. It's okay if it's not okay, but it's suitable if they do get water in there, that they're actually created so with positive drainage so that water can drain back out. And then also there's another place that uses radiant heat to put heat up through the floors to help dry things out and be back in business within a much shorter amount of time. That's another set of solutions. The idea that we want to be thinking about these projects comprehensively through all of these impacts and through all these solutions is really key. And so how we phase them in with the changing climate is critical. Cities don't change on the stop of a dime, I would say, or on the turn of a dime in the United States, and particularly in this area. It takes a while for change to happen. And so how do we understand the changes, the risks that are coming up, and then also build them into some of the comprehensive planning so that they can be implemented over time? You have a question?
There's a way to visit our universities in Guatemala and give a speech or a conference and a presentation.
Yes, it is. I'd be happy to do that. And Vida, can I contact you directly? Okay, great. I'll give you my card. Over at our booth, we have others. But the idea that this is something that's useful for both where we're working now and then also in other global environments is very interesting to me. Thank you, Vida. Yeah. The last thing I wanted to talk about is really putting these things together. It really is important to be looking at multiple impacts, multiple adaptive solutions, and multiple ways of bringing them and phasing them into a climate adaptive future. And so how we put those together is an amazing new research area. Many cities haven't thought about more than one or two. Many designers haven't thought about more than one or two, but multiple impacts and multiple projections will be coming into play here in the coming days and years. And so developing a composed set of design moves where you're thinking about your built environment, how it works with these ecosystems that are valued by the state and the people that are living there, as well as your waterfront uses and waterfront opportunities is really what this is about.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.